Joining us now, activist, organizer, and educator, DeRay McKesson, an activist, writer, and an MSNBC contributor. Brittany Packnett Cunningham. They are co-hosts of the podcast Pod Save the People and co-founders of Campaign Zero, a nonprofit to end police violence. DeRay, I'll start with you, but I'd love to hear from both of you on this, from your experience in past protests and in dealing with this specific issue. What has worked? What has not worked?
So let me zoom out for a second and sort of set the context. We're in a moment where a third of all the people killed by a stranger is actually killed by a police officer. And we're mindful that in March and April of 2020, the police killed the same number of people and at the same rate as they did in March and April of 2019. So COVID, quarantine, lockdown actually didn't change anything. In 2019 was actually the first year ever where Black people were more afraid of being killed by a police officer than being killed by community violence. So we think about this issue as a consistent terror in communities. The police kill around 1,100 people a year. Now, when I think about what works, and, you know, Brittany has been, we have been partners on this work for the past 5 years, is that we know that focusing on policies, practices, and solutions really do change the outcomes. So we just launched something called 8can'twait.org that is about these 8 policies that when they're in play, when a police department goes from 0 of them to 8 of them, there's a 70% reduction in police violence, and they're all common sense. Banning chokeholds and strangleholds. Only 28 of the 100 largest police departments ban chokeholds and strangleholds today. Restricting or banning shooting into moving vehicles, requiring de-escalation. You'd be shocked. Not a lot of police departments require these things, but they actually do matter a lot.
Brittany?
I mean, DeRay's point is so well made, and I'm really, really glad that folks are able to see that work and know that these are common sense solutions. We can talk about what works in protests, but the truth of the matter is protests come toward the end of the continuum. There's something that caused them to happen that spurred people to action, and in this case, it wasn't what we're seeing on the street. It was violence from police. It was the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and a list that frankly is too long to name on this broadcast. So when we recognize that protests come toward the end of the continuum, we're forced to reckon with the fact that transformational, systemic, urgent, bold policy change is what's going to actually stop the continuum ultimately and not bring us back to this point in another few years. The kinds of policies that DeRay walked through don't cost much money, and they don't actually require an act of Congress or even an act of the state legislature. They just require that police chiefs actually have the courage of conviction to do what we know works and what keeps everybody safe.
Claire McCaskill,
Brittany,
jump in.
Yeah, Brittany, it's Claire. Good morning. Thank you for all you have done for many years in this space. You just mentioned police chiefs, and they are hired by mayors and city council. And I think we get distracted sometimes by looking at the federal level. And as you know, as well as anybody in this country, these are local police departments. These are not federal agents that are causing this problem. Last night we had an election in Ferguson, and Ella won. Talk about activism at the local level. People don't think it's sexy to try to change the city council or change the mayor. But really, I think that everybody needs to realize, what you realize, is that's how you really get change in this space.
So I'm going to push a little bit and say that 2 things are actually true. That we know that local police officers, police departments, and police unions take their direction and get signals from the federal government. Then when you've got a president that has been invoking violence and fear, not just in the general public, but through police departments, and has encouraged police departments to act in the ways that they are, that absolutely contributes to the actions that we see at the local level. So there is blame here to go around, and we should be very clear, Trump deserves a whole mountain of it. But you are also right. The second thing that is true is that there are 18,000 police departments across this country, and much of that policy is being set locally. That's why 8can'twait matters so much, because those are changes that can happen right on the ground. You know, earlier, Jonathan Capehart said that the last round of protests we've seen has lasted 9 days. In Ferguson, we were on the ground for over 400 days. It was one of the longest direct social action campaigns in this country's entire history. And we are just now getting to the point where Ferguson has its first Black mayor. We are just now getting to the point where we can have these conversations. And still, when we look at the case of Jason Stockley back in St. Louis, when we look at so many other cases in my hometown and in my home state, we recognize that the kind of policy solutions we needed in Missouri and across the country still have not come to bear. So those 8 can't wait at the local level, and we need to make sure that we're holding this person in the White House accountable.
DeRay, it's Willie Geist. Good to have you and Brittany both on this morning. Brittany started to anticipate my question when I want to know from both of you who are on the ground, whose lives were redirected from education to working on the ground there on police violence in Ferguson and all those years since in August of 2014. What has changed since Ferguson, since the point of all this is to make things better and to get those policy changes? So as you look at the nearly 6 years since Ferguson, have things gotten better, DeRay? Have things changed on the backs of all this activism?
So I'd answer that in 2 ways. The first is when we look at the numbers, the police have actually killed more people since the protests, not less. Since 2014, at the raw number level, the police have actually not killed any less since the 2014 number. It's only been increasing. Now, the bright spot is that we actually do see a statistically significant decrease in urban America, in cities. In the top 30 cities, in the largest 100 cities, we actually do see a decrease that's being offset by increases in suburban and rural communities in a way that actually erases the good work that we're seeing in cities. But the second thing I'll say is zooming out is that what we know about solutions is that it's 2 real buckets. The first is how do we reduce the power of the police? So when we look at use of force policies, that's about saying we want to reduce the power they have to inflict harm in communities. The second is how do we shrink the role of the police? You know, most people don't realize that only 5% of the arrests that happen in the country actually happen for violent crime. But we staff police departments is at 50%, 60% of the arrests that happen in the country happen for violent crime. And that 5% number is actually an FBI number. It's been 5% arrests for violent crime for over 20 years. We don't need somebody with a gun to go intervene in cases where there's a mental health crisis. We don't need somebody with a gun to be at car accidents. We don't need somebody with a gun to find missing kids. Like, we need to take all of those responsibilities, shift those to experts, and make sure that the resources shift to those experts too. We don't need to fund policing in the way that we do. We have to shrink the role of the policing apparatus wholly.
DeRay McKesson and Brittany Packnett Cunningham, thank you both for being on the show this morning. Really appreciate it. And coming up, 2 of the top members of the House leadership, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, join us. Morning Joe is coming right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.